Hi, I'm here with Paula Cordeiro from University of San Diego. Paula, thanks for joining. You've done a lot of interesting work in education, and you're, I think, unique as an academic in that you both write about school leadership as well as work with school leaders directly yourself. I want to talk to you about one specific piece that you put out recently titled Education Interrupted, Edify's Roadmap to Continuing Learning During the 2020 Pandemic. So if you could just start off by talking about kind of what you were hoping to learn during this project and how you went about doing that.
Sure. Thanks, Amir. Maybe I'll provide a little bit of context of where I'm working now so that you'll better understand the questions that we've been asking. So we're working with non-state school leaders in low and middle income countries. And I'm a university academic, but I'm also a practitioner. I like to think of myself as a pracademic. And so one leg in each place. And so I'm the vice president of education for an NGO part-time. And what happened is they said, listen, we're working in 11 countries. We have over 6,000 schools in those countries. We provide training, school leadership training, a little bit of teacher training with their partner schools. They provide micro loans. Again, these are low fee independent schools, usually mom and pop schools owned by a local entrepreneur, maybe a family. We also at Edify provide technology, advice, support, and coaching. So they have been doing that for a long time now, expanding in different countries. And then the pandemic hits in the middle of all the on-the-ground trainings, and suddenly the local staff were no longer able to visit schools. So what do they do? So if you think about, I'm working in central office. We have in the United States probably about a dozen people who work for Edify. And as VP for education, I have a director of technology. So he and I started talking and said, well, what's happening in the schools? By now it was April of last year. The schools closed in March. None of us knew when we were going to be reopening. So we thought we need to find out what we are doing, and then in what ways can our staff better support schools while they're closed. So we, in April, we started developing a survey, made all kinds of decisions around that survey, how it was going to be distributed, because we wanted to know what was happening for children around learning, of course, in particular, and what challenges school leaders were having as well as they thought about when schools would be reopening. So again, 11 countries, and we did a stratified random survey and ended up having about 380 schools in the survey. So our questions that we were looking at: how, if at all, do non-state schools respond to student learning needs during a crisis? So were they responding in the first place? And then what were they doing? Secondly, we were concerned, what were the major concerns of the school leaders as they thought about being closed and then reopening? And it wasn't really a research question, but we got at it anyway. And this was, what kind of educational innovations maybe are taking place amongst all of these schools? So again, about 380 something schools, 11 nations. Developed the survey, had about 12 questions, and they were yes, no questions, demographic questions in addition. And then we had some sequential questions and some open-ended questions as well. And our staff delivered the surveys by phone. So we trained the staff. We trained 22 staff members in how you deliver this kind of survey, how to input the data, and then the data was all sent to us, and we did the analysis. bearing in mind, Samir, that, this had to be translated into dozens of languages, because so many of these school owners are so much more comfortable speaking in whatever local language. In places like Ghana, there are so many languages. So there could have been some issues. This report has been turned into a referee journal article that's being published. It's been accepted for publication. It'll come out sometime probably in April. And one of the limitations was the translation piece of this. So we did all the data collection in May, started analyzing it, and then we have the results. And the report came out last summer. So the key findings, that 75% of the schools, and by the way, of the schools we surveyed, depended on the nation, and we have core schools and client schools in different categories. So we have more schools that we surveyed in some nations. But it was a stratified random sample, stratified by region. So we at least, at a minimum, had 10 urban, 10 suburban, and 10 peri-urban schools that had at least 100 children per school. 75% of the schools were reported doing something to continue learning. And so 25% of the schools did absolutely nothing, closed their doors, and nothing was going on. So what were they doing? Well, first we wanted to know who was doing whatever they were doing. And in many cases, it depended upon the region. So we broke the data out by regions. We work with 3 countries, Peru, Guatemala, and the DR in the Americas. We have 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and then we work in India, in Northeast India. So we divided it out by region, and then we also divided it out by country as well. There were more similarities in the Americas, and Northeast India was more similar to sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of a little bit of Ethiopia. Ethiopia tended to be more like the Americas in some ways. And part of that, by the way, is based upon where they fall in the World Bank categories of low-income nations versus middle-income nations. So many of the schools were not paying their teachers, or only partially paying their teachers, because they were not receiving any kind of tuition. 29% of all the schools were paying their teachers to continue to work with children. And about a quarter of them were paying some of the teachers, and another quarter were not paying them at all, but expecting them to work. So it was all over the place on that. And there were regional, most people in the Americas were paying their teachers to do the work. So what were the teachers doing? And if the teacher wasn't doing it, then the proprietor or the head teacher was doing it alone. And it ranged from simply calling families, checking in with them, seeing how the family's doing, to using WhatsApp, sending out information via WhatsApp. Or they may have been, in other cases, again, depended upon the region. They could have been, they had radio, that the government was offering radio or television programs, and then they were sending home materials to complement the radio or television. Like Uganda had a lot of television going on, whereas other countries at that time didn't have any radio or television. They also, a few countries, in particular in the Americas, but a little bit in our schools in Ghana, were using learning management systems, mostly Google Classroom, but some other LMSs as well. And then, so TV, radio, learning management systems, some were just simply paper and pencil, and messaging apps. And then there were a few countries where, because they have basically minimal connectivity or access to technology, which would be West Africa, Liberia, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, And that's where there was some paper and pencil materials. So then we asked school leaders, what are your major concerns? And they fell into 3 categories. Financial sustainability being the first one. These are schools that receive no government support. They don't get none of the schools in our survey, hardly any partner schools that Edify has, receive any government support. So they're totally tuition dependent. Some of them, they always have collection issues because they're working with low-income families. So at any given time, when there's no pandemic, there are going to be a certain number of families who are in arrears on their tuition payments. And the way the semester fell at that time, parents hadn't paid for the next term in many countries. So all of a sudden, with the pandemic, they are receiving no income. Another major concern, health and safety of the children and the teachers. What happens when I reopen was a question they were asking. The government is giving us no guidance on anything. And since then, government started to, but last spring, last summer, even as late as September, October, there was nothing available in many of these nations. And if there was something available, it was vague and really not helpful. And they were also worried about even themselves, the proprietors, the owners of these schools. Some of them said, you know, I'm in my 50s, 60s. I don't have the best health myself. And many of my teachers, a lot of them hire retired teachers to help them. And then the third and other key area, they were very, very worried about the loss of student learning. Many, in particular, Rwanda and Burkina Faso, Liberia, they talked about children not returning to school afterwards at all, that 14, 15, 16-year-old. So that was a grave concern to them. So those were our key findings.
Got it. And as you look, you know, kind of where school systems are now, where some have reopened, some are looking towards reopening, and if you had to kind of take the learning from your study and kind of suggest, you know, implications for organizations like Global School Leaders that work with school leaders in this current moment, what do you think these implications are for us and for others like us?
Yeah, so it's such a great question. And so so Edify right now has figured this out and set goals as much as we can figure it out. And we're learning from some of our colleagues as well. And that is, so let's take, you know, hybrid learning in the many forms of hybrid learning. So we do a lot of work in technology. And originally, they were computer labs and some things that maybe were not the best directions to go in, okay? So now, instead of supporting schools and encouraging schools to build computer labs, instead, our ed tech staff are doing trainings on using like an LMS, like Colibri is one of them. Colibri is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, it's free of charge. And whereas with Google Classroom and other LMSs, you have to pay for them. Colibri can be used, it was created for low and middle income countries where there's major challenges with connectivity. Like Khan Academy is already built into it, and all kinds of other resources can be used online, can be used offline. So what we have to figure out is, we looked individually at nations. We created country reports from this report. And in those reports, how we are responding with preparing school leaders for future you know, pandemics or natural disasters or coup d'etat, who knows, is how can you be prepared given the connectivity or lack of connectivity in your country? Is it going to be different responses for more rural schools? We didn't find any difference in the peri-urban schools. We found some differences in some countries with urban, suburban. So how can they be prepared Is it a better paper and pencil system that they need to be prepared with? Is it more of, we need to have tablets that children can take home? Is it we need to be working more with the government and telecoms to ensure families can have connectivity? Do we set up hotspots? So we've come up with a model that looks at synchronous learning, asynchronous learning. So I'd love to share that with lots of other people out there.
All right, fascinating. Thanks, Paula. I guess just to kind of bring this to a close, as you think of school leadership and kind of what we know, what we don't know about school leadership in lower and middle income countries, what do you think are kind of most pressing questions we should be thinking about uh, on this topic moving forward?
Yeah, well, I have a bias toward people being on the ground and listening to others. Our staff are all local staff. They know their country. They know their partner schools. They're constantly listening. So when people like me bring, I can bring the research to the table. I'm bringing research that's predominantly been created within an English-speaking, European, North American, Australian perspective. It doesn't necessarily, it's not contextualized. And so we have to contextualize, we have to look at the importance of contextual knowledge. Also, even in a place like the US, when I'm training and working with school leaders, we talk about you have to go to the evidence, go to the evidence. Well, where do they get the evidence from? Is there a central clearinghouse? Yes. But what works clearinghouse? Fabulous, part of the Institute for Education Sciences. But when you go in there, even on the first page, one of my students said recently, like, school leadership is not a heading, and it's not. Charter schools, literacy, teachers, and then if you go into the teachers section, you will see some information about school leaders. But even in this nation, it's so difficult to find the evidence. And when you look in the clearinghouse materials, it's pretty difficult to navigate. And you come up with a couple of programs that have sufficient evidence behind them that we can really learn and transport that to somewhere else in the United States. Maybe not transport it to Burkina Faso.
Great. Thank you, Paula. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
My pleasure, Samir. Thanks for inviting me.